Okay, welcome everybody to the Center for Robotics and Biosystems seminar. Today's speaker is a perfect fit for the Center for Robotics and Biosystems because what he does is robotics and biosystems. I'm very pleased to introduce Chen Li. He's a professor in mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and he's also a member of the Laboratory for Computational Sensing and Robotics there. He got his PhD at Georgia Tech in physics, and he's performed his postdoc research at UC Berkeley. His research aims are at creating a new field of pterodynamics, and his lab is called the Pterodynamics Lab, analogous to aero and hydrodynamics at the interface of biology, robotics, and physics, and using pterodynamics to understand animal locomotion and advanced robot locomotion in the real world. And Chen has helped run the RoboPhysics sessions at APS meetings annually, which has really contributed a lot to our field. Dr. Li has won several early career awards, including the Burroughs Wellcome Fund Career Award at the Scientific Interface, a Beckman Young Investigator Award, and an Army Research Office Young Investigator Award, and he was selected as a Kavli Frontiers of Science Fellow by the National Academy of Sciences. He and his students have won several Best Paper Awards, including at IROS, Advanced Robotics, Bioinspiration and Biomimetics, and Integrative and Comparative Biology. And his talk today will be on Towards Understanding Animal and Robot Locomotion in Complex 3D Terrain. So please join me in welcoming Chen Li.
Thank you, Kevin, for the nice introduction, and also thank you, Kevin and Paul, for inviting me to this seminar. So I will be mostly talking about my lab's work over the last few years, although I will give just a very brief history of my trajectory. Yeah, so we have been envisioning having robots help humans in all kinds of important applications. So what's shown here are a bunch of examples of terrestrial robots that have been developed mostly in the last couple of decades, and some of them are already working really well, robustly in the real world. The more well-known examples include robotic vacuums and more recently self-driving cars. And when we look at how robots deal with the problem of locomotion in complex environment, it has very often been considered as a problem of obstacle avoidance. So here as an example, the self-driving car is using sensors to scan its surrounding and create a geometric representation or map of its surrounding. You can then plan a safe trajectory to avoid anything other than the paved road, and then very often transition between different driving modes to reach your goal. And in order for this to work well, there are two premises. First, the interaction between your vehicle or robot and your environment, in this case, the wheel-ground interaction, needs to be well understood. And second, your vehicle or robot needs to be readily controlled to follow the planned trajectory well. And this is thanks to, especially the first one is, but also the second one is really thanks to development in the fields of tire and vehicle dynamics for paved roads, as well as terramechanics over the last few decades for off-road vehicle-ground interaction. Analogous to this, we also have very good understanding of the aerodynamics and hydrodynamics of both biological and artificial devices moving in fluids, flying and underwater locomotion. On the other hand, for terrestrial locomotion that's non-wheeled, that is biological or bio-inspired robot locomotion, our understanding for a long time had been relatively limited to relatively simple, flat, rigid ground, and very often looking at how to maintain near steady state single mode locomotion, such as walking and running. While we have really fantastic progress of these kinds of models, we already have, through decades of development, we have had fantastic models describing such leg-ground interaction. And this really is the basis of a lot of modern legged robots. So just a little bit of history. Mark Raybert, he, before starting Boston Dynamics, was actually a professor at first CMU and then MIT, and he studied legged robot interacting with the ground, making use of fundamental mechanics understanding to build these beautiful early robots, which had really provided the foundation of more recent Boston Dynamic robots. You can see here they have elements in the leg that's built in to make use of the slip-like bouncing dynamics on rigid ground. And this is also true for other more recent robots, as shown by some examples here. However, when it comes to more complex terrestrial environments, such as desert sand or Martian soil, where you have ground that can deform and flow under your feet, or forest floor, where you have a lot of obstacles piled together, and earthquake rubble, a similar terrain, we can see that obviously these relatively simple ground interaction models will not apply. So in order to make progress, we need to begin to develop more tools and models to systematically study and understand the physical interaction with complex terrain. Or in other words, we need to create this new field of terra dynamics. And really this is first started by my PhD advisor, Dan Goldman, in his lab. Through an experimental physics approach, his lab has focused on understanding all kinds of different forms of locomotion in granular environment. And I was fortunate to be one of his first PhD students, and I worked on legged locomotion. So I studied how lizards, how legged robots run on sand and eventually create physics models. And here I really have to, I'm very grateful for Paul Ambenhauer, who at the time was collaborating closely with us. I really vividly remember Paul coming down to Georgia Tech and just watching carefully how the leg of this robot interacted with sand. At the time, I was a very naive junior student, and I had no idea. I was able to do experiments fairly well, but I just had no idea how to do modeling, and it is through observing how Paul carefully observed such interaction and then coming up with really simplified models that capture the essential physics that I got really inspired, and I have taken kind of inspiration and try to do this myself. Yeah, so eventually through my towards the end of my PhD, we created a resistive force theory for granular media, which is essentially experimentally mapping out the lift and the drag forces, if you will, if you think about them as similar as a fluid, and then apply that to be able to predict locomotion fairly accurately. Yeah, so after I left Georgia Tech, I worked with Bob Foe at UC Berkeley to think about how we can expand this approach to try to understand this complex locomotor interaction beyond granular media. And the system I happened to pick was these highly cluttered large obstacles that you find in forest floor and earthquake rubble. This is for two reasons. In Bob Foe's lab, they have a lot of these cockroaches, and one particular species is from rainforest that has to deal with these all the time. And also at the time, I happened to have seen a video from Dan Kotochek's group, in which this robot is very miserably stuck in such earthquake rubble. So yeah, but that said, people have attempted to do this and actually had reasonable success, except that it's mostly through trial and error. Here is a very early video from Kotochek's lab around early 2000, and you can see this Rex robot can actually do pretty well overcoming these fairly large obstacles through it's very nice mechanical design as well as human manual control. But we still lack a way to do this in a principled way. So yeah, so my hope is if we can have some kind of principled understanding with predictive models, we can eventually begin to make predictions of how you can transition between various modes to reach where you want in this kind of environment. Yeah, and this is the video I mentioned of the Rex failing in such terrain. So animals, obviously, they can do this really well. As we all know, in this example above, you can see a cockroach is making transitions between several different modes to go through this very cluttered grass obstacles. Yeah, so when we look at our understanding, our more quantitative and predictive models of legged locomotion, we can see that the majority of these models, as I had mentioned earlier already, is really focusing on how to generate and how to stabilize a limited cycle single mode locomotion, such as walking and running. However, when you start to interact with these large cluttered obstacles in such real world terrain, you can see that this is unlikely going to be the case. The system gets often thrown away from this. So we have a relative lack of theories or even concepts to think about locomotor transitions. Yeah, so when I first thought about this problem, you can see a forest floor like this just seems formidable. You have all kinds of stuff piled together. They're heterogeneous, both in the physical properties and the spatial distribution. So how do we even begin to study them? So the very simple first step that I took when I was a postdoc was I decided to zoom in on one particular type of obstacles, which are these dense vegetation. And I picked grass as one relatively simple model terrain. But even real grass can be quite heterogeneous and complex. So what I ended up doing is to use laser cut paper to assemble into these artificial grass, much like you can use a wind tunnel to enable repeatable experiments. And in this study in Bob Fo's lab, what I found is that if you look at one attempt of the animal traversing, you can see it seems quite stochastic. The animal can sometimes do this behavior of just pushing and then rolling its body to go through the narrow gaps. And other times it might try to force its way, pushing forward and climbing and falling forward. And if you look at one trial, you can't really predict what it's going to do. But when you have a lot of trials, this is actually from almost 300 trials, you can see that patterns start to emerge. Despite it being very stochastic, the animals can actually seem to use this particular mode, rolling, which is shown here, most frequently, about 2/3 of the time to traverse. And this turned out to also be the fastest mode. It is significantly faster than if the animal ever uses any other modes. So, that's part of the discovery from my earlier work. And in my lab, when we first started, I was thinking how we can really begin from here and go towards something more like a real world terrain. And obviously, this is not like air and water, in which you have a uniform media. You have these really large heterogeneity. So the very naive approach that we have taken is to abstract these into different kinds of obstacles, which I'll elaborate in just a little bit. But our hope is that if we can understand how the locomotor modes and transitions emerge from locomotor interaction, which can be controlled, then we can perhaps piece these together to begin to understand and even control robots to go where they want in a probabilistic manner. Yeah, so we take this integrative, interdisciplinary approach. We study animals as model organisms, which can help reveal capabilities and limits. They can also provide inspiration for robots. We also build robots, very often very minimalistic robots, which we consider more as physical models through which we can do repeatable experiments and varying parameters to test hypotheses. And they can, and then based on observation of both animals and robots, we can then try to come up with physics models to reveal general principles, and in some cases even have quantitatively predictive models which can help reveal the mechanisms of animal locomotion, both success and failure, as well as provide design tools and action strategies. Yeah, so this is just a kind of summary of a lot of the studies we have attempted. So we develop new tools to enable systematic experiments. Here, as an example, we created, this is a more recent version of the grass-like beams, in which we focus the bending at the bottom, and then we can change the thickness of this little film to control the stiffness. We also develop imaging methods to combine multiple cameras with these automatic tag tracking to enable 3D quantification of the interaction, which turned out to be somewhat challenging because of the occlusion. And also this is a very recent development. We also developed this. Actually, the device was built quite a while ago, but we only recently analyzed this data and it's in review. But we made this terrain treadmill, with which we can confine the animal to the top to then enable it to move over a long spatial temporal scale. And using these various tools, we can then study in a systematic experimental physics manner the interaction and the resulting locomotor transitions in both animals and robots, as seen in these variety of challenges. So we have bumps that are quite high, but you can still move over. We have gaps that you need to bridge across. We have rigid obstacles that we call pillars that you need to go around. We have flexible and movable obstacles like beams, and then we also have, in this case, of self-righting, because the animals and robots very often get flipped over in such rough terrain. So from these studies, we eventually come up with physics models. So we have so far had done 3 different levels of model. We have the very simplified potential energy landscape modeling, which I will focus on. We also have dynamic templates, which can predict the movement using a very minimalistic model. And finally, we have more complex multi-body dynamic simulation, which are more like an experiment on a computer. So I'll, for the next 20 minutes or so, I'll focus on this one project, highlight one project to study beam interaction, how the locomotor transitions emerge, which makes use of this potential energy landscape models. Yeah, so but before I do that, I want to emphasize that we are greatly inspired by successes in studying biolocomotion, using the approach to first look at relatively simple feed-forward interaction mechanics. So we all know that animals and robots hopefully should have very good sensory feedback ability to adapt to their environments. But it is turned out to be quite fruitful to first study completely feed-forward robotic systems, as shown in these examples, as well as study animals in the more feed-forward regime, where their interaction mechanics plays an important role in the emergence of their movement. So in our case, we focus on studying the bandwidth-limited escape behavior or emergency self-righting behavior, in which the feed-forward effect plays a dominant role. And we also start with a feed-forward robot. Once we have sufficient understanding, we can then build on that to further study the sensory feedback control. Okay, so here is the project I want to highlight on the legged locomotion transitions. So this is led by my PhD student, Ratan, who just defended and just got an offer yesterday. I was pretty happy with that. So in this study, he focused on this transition of cockroaches going through grass-like beams, much simplified, transitioning from what we call a pitch to a roll mode. So here's what a pitch mode looks like. It really is the animal pushing down the beams, in which his body has to pitch up because of the restoring torque. And here's the animal initially try to push, but before it even proceeds forward much, it makes a quick transition into this rolling mode. So how do we begin to understand how this transition emerged from the physical interaction and how it can be controlled? The simplest model we came up with is to merely consider the potential energy of the system. So this is an extremely simplified model. There's a lot of assumptions and approximations, and we're completely ignoring the dynamics, but it turns out to give us a lot of useful insight. So here we consider the animal as just a simple ellipsoid, which their body shape resembles, and then these 2 plates as rigid plates with torsion springs. We can then calculate the total potential energy of the system if we have measurements from the real system. And then here, what I'm showing is a a cross-section of this potential energy landscape. It depends on both the translation and rotation of this body in the neighborhood of these two beams. What I'm showing here is just the potential energy as a function of the body roll and body pitch of this body when it is exactly in the middle of the two beams and very close to the beams. So you can see that there are three locominima basins. In the middle here, you have a pitch basin, and if the system falls to the minima of that basin, it would look like this. So it pitch up slightly and bending the beam just very slightly. If you pitch up more, it's going to increase the gravitational energy too quickly, or if you pitch up less, it's going to increase the elastic energy quickly. So that's why you have a minima here. And then you also have these two other minima, which corresponds to the body rolling to the left or to the right, not deflecting the beams. So you can see that these states of the system resembles what we see in the real animal during the pitch and the roll mode. So what this just suggests is that perhaps this transition from a pitch mode to a roll mode is a transition of the system from being attracted to this pitch basin to this roll basin, in which you have to overcome a potential energy barrier. So this is our first hypothesis, that this transition might be viewed as a destabilizing barrier crossing transition, destabilizing yourself from this attraction. And in addition, how can you do this? So we had a very naive hypothesis in the very beginning. So if you look at these animals oscillating itself, interacting with the beams, their body actually oscillates quite a bit because of their leg propulsion, which is cyclic. So we know that for a microscopic particle in a potential well, when it has some kinetic energy fluctuation from, say, thermal fluctuation, it has some chances of escaping from that well, crossing a barrier, if that fluctuation is comparable to the barrier. So here we hypothesize that if this kinetic energy fluctuation is sufficient, is comparable to these barrier. Actually, I misspelled. This should be a comparable. If this is comparable to this potential energy barrier, then you would be able to make this transition by crossing the barrier, and this would be possible even without any sensory feedback. Yeah. So to test this, my student Ratan built a robotic physical model, which is a physical realization of our simple model. The body is suspended through a gyroscope mechanism that allows it to freely pitch and roll with little friction and damping. And also the beams have torsion springs. So he can then drive it forward as well as oscillate it up and down. We also tried rotational oscillation, and qualitatively the results are similar. Yeah, so here are representative trials of the body going forward without oscillation. You can see if it's in the middle of the beams, it's going to be stuck in that pitch mode. And if it has sufficient oscillation, it very quickly transitions to this rolling mode. And after Ratan did this many times, visualizing here, so this is the potential energy landscape we constructed from the measurement. He actually tracked the 3D motion as illustrated here to reconstruct the landscape and then show where the system is, which are these dots with a trajectory. So each of these trajectories is one trial. So what we can see is that indeed, when the system is stuck in the pitch mode, it is attracted in that pitch basin. These ones that happen to go out is actually an artifact, which I can explain in more detail. But then when the system make the transition, they all escape from that pitch basin and reach the roll basin. And then we can also quantitatively test the second hypothesis. So what Ratan did is to measure from the minima of the pitch basin into the roll basin to find that saddle point, to measure the potential energy barrier, the minimum barrier you have to cross to make this transition, which is shown in this black curve. So it actually changes as you move forward, indicated by X position. And you can see that it goes down to very low, and this green line is the measured system kinetic energy fluctuation. And we found that it is exactly when the kinetic energy fluctuation is greater than the barrier that the system makes this transition. So this confirmed our second hypothesis. And this is not surprising because this is a purely physics-driven system. There's no central feedback control. In addition, we were curious to see what the environment might have an effect on these transitions. So Ratan had varied the stiffness of the beams from very low, very flimsy to very high. And you can see that the landscape changed quantitatively. It's in the cases towards the left, especially this one, this pitch basin had disappeared. And how high the pitch and the roll basin compare to each other also changed as you increase the stiffness. So that's actually shown here. The two curves are showing as you move forward, which is the X position, how the minimum energy of the pitch basin and the roll basin compare. The dashed line is from a pure model, and the solid line is from the real system, measured from the real system. So you can see that as when you try to overcome very flimsy beams, the pitch basin is lower than the roll basin, which is not surprising because if you roll, you have to raise your center of mass. If you just push forward, if the beam is very flimsy, you don't have to overcome much potential energy barrier. But when the beams are really stiff, then it is much less favorable to push across because you have to overall, through this traversal, overcome a huge potential energy barrier or inject a huge energy. So simply driven by physics, the systems can either stay in the more favorable mode, pitch mode here, or find the roll more favorable mode here, roll mode here. So these are all, yes.
How does it know which direction to roll in, or does it just try both of them randomly, or what's the story there?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So actually what we did is just to simplify the analysis and representation, we flipped all the videos or the kinematic data so that it always rolled to one side. In the case of animals, it's pretty random, but in the robot, if I remember, I think it's all to one side because there's a slight asymmetry in the system that just breaks that symmetry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and then so that's all about the robot. So Ratan also did all these for animals. So we found everything to be consistent except one thing, which is where this transition happens. So you can see that this is in the span is where it happened. It actually happened well before the potential energy barrier had dropped to below the kinetic energy fluctuation. And again, this is not surprising because the animals, they're not dumb robots that just oscillate themselves like particles. They can use a lot of sensory feedback and even kind of perhaps planning and learning to do this. So we haven't studied those mechanisms carefully, but we believe that these are likely contributing to their ability to do this. So we are just recently beginning to look into this. So this is a recent study led by a more junior PhD student, Chen. He had performed experiments to quantify the kinematics of the body and the hind legs in more detail. And he found 4 things that might be helping them. So the first is that they are going to tuck their hind legs in right before they roll. We think that is reducing the roll stability. But yeah, we don't know if without force measurements, we can't say that for sure. And then the second one is that the one hind leg is pushing, seems to be pushing, whereas the other is retracting. So again, we think this might be generating a roll torque. But again, we still have to make force measurements to confirm this. And then we also found very peculiar head movement. So their head actually bends up and down relative to the body. It's not strictly periodic, but there seems to be some rhythm. And then that's before they make the roll transition. And after they roll into the gap, they are going to continue to flex the head as well as the abdomen. So we think that this is maybe helping them break the frictional or interlocking contact of their body kind of asperities with these edges of the beam. And then the head flexion, we first thought that it might be somehow reducing that barrier, and we modeled that, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So right now we're testing the hypothesis whether this can be a form of active sensing, adjusting yourself to tune in to tune your sensing, but in this case, sensing the resistance from the environment, the physical interaction. Yeah, so to better understand the principles here, Yaqing has just developed a new robot which looked similar to the earlier, except that he has 4 sensors embedded. He has the head, the body, and the abdomen segments and joints that can be controlled. And he also has and the control is over here is under actuated, because in the animal that roll and pitch is not just controlled by the animal, it's also partly determined by the interaction. So we have this the motors are connected to the bodies through a spring. Yeah, so we want to use this to systematically study how to sense and use physical interaction and act on the physical interaction intelligently. And one intriguing hypothesis we had is this: if you consider a human going from one basin to another, over kind of crossing this mountain ridge, we can see where that settle point and just choose that path, which is what these people do. But such a potential energy landscape, we can't really see. Can we somehow infer it and choose some easy path? So one thought we had is we show that these systems, the behavior of the systems are strongly dominated by the potential energy landscape. And the potential energy landscape is basically a description of the conservative forces, but there are also non-conservative forces at play. However, if the conservative forces are playing a dominant role, then perhaps if we measure these contact forces, we can somehow get an idea of the conservative forces. Even if not accurately, we'll get some idea in bulk or in the ballpark. And if we can then use that to infer such landscape, we can then make the transition as we decide. So another quick demonstration along these lines. This is much simpler. This is just a simple rigid body. What my student Shihan recently did is to develop a simulation, dynamic simulation, in which this body can sense its contact forces from the environment, as shown here, and you can then use that together with the energy landscape to determine which mode is more favorable and act upon it. So here is a feed forward without any control. When the beams are very stiff, here we don't push it forward with an actuator that's strong enough, so it's going to be stuck here. But now if you have some force feedback, so we detect, oh, these beams are too stiff and the rolling would be more favorable, we can then actuate this to roll and then let it roll back, and then we can demonstrate this. Okay, so I have spent some time talking about this beam traversal example, but we have, as I mentioned, we have studied these other distinct challenges, and initially we didn't really expect anything common to come out of this, but we actually found quite surprising commonalities. So first, we found that these interactions all result in stochastic yet very stereotyped locomotor modes and transitions, as shown here. And we found that earlier we didn't model all of them with potential energy landscape, but recently some of them we did, but we added this to all of them, and we found that when you take this view, this can be explained by the fact that on your landscape you have these deep basins, these small number of deep basins that the systems are attracted to, which shows up as these modes, and this transition would be barrier crossing transitions. And finally, again, earlier we didn't take this landscape view, but in particularly robot experiments, but also some animal experiments, we have empirically discovered strategies to help make desired transitions to traverse these obstacles or to self-right, which are summarized here, which give you a boost in your traverse or self-righting performance. But when we look at we use this landscape view more recently, we found that this can be categorized into 3 things. You can either steer yourself on the landscape, or you can modify your shape or how you deform yourself. If you do that not to a great amount, then you will quantitatively change the landscape to increase or decrease the barrier, which is going to help suppress or facilitate some transition. But also you can do that a lot to even remove some basins or add basins, with basically changing the topology to eliminate or to add new modes. So there are these surprising generalities. Yeah, and this is just a video kind of showing a metaphor we think that in this case that we have studied with these large obstacles or these very strenuous self-righting, the potential energy barrier is so high that you really have to understand it and do control or actuate or plan your motion well to be able to not waste your effort as this little dog is doing. Yeah, and this we think can also have implications for understanding of biological behavior. So people have studied biological behavior for a long time, and one thing that's known for over almost 100 years is that animal behavior is very stereotyped. Theoretically, you can move your degrees of freedom in arbitrary trajectories, but when we look at animal movement, it's very stereotyped. And these are some recent beautiful work quantifying animal behavior, showing stereotyped high probability density distribution. So what we think that our work has shown is that in this case, the highly stereotyped modes might be evidence that these animals have, through evolution, evolved either both morphology and locomotor strategies that are well adapted to these strenuous barrier crossing tasks.
One other quick question.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think this makes total sense in terms of having these kinds of strategies, but I mean, how badly would throwing yourself around randomly actually do in kind of escaping these kinds of traps? If you just kind of oscillated in various directions, gradually increasing the force or scale of the oscillations, I mean, how well does that do in terms of getting out of these kinds of traps?
Yeah, that's great question. It will work if you just continue to ramp up your kinetic energy. Actually, we have another study that demonstrated just that. So the self-righting, I can show a quick video. Go back. Yeah, here this video. Yeah, so you can see this cockroach, that one of the primary self-righting modes is for them to open their wings to try to push against the ground. But it turned out that the potential energy barrier is really high. They can rarely build up enough kinetic energy by doing this. And that usually gives them a pitch motion because the wings are symmetric. So what happens is, what turned out to be important is that they have this flailing of the legs, which we looked a little bit into if there's any rhythm or learning, or maybe evidence of learning. We didn't see much, so it seems to be quite random. So we think that in this case, yeah, that's evidence of what you just described. Although we had done another study which using modeling, in which we this one shown below, that we have this template modeling. So we started with random oscillation, but once we have a model that's predictive, we can actually do it right at the right moment to kind of, it's kind of like, I forgot the word.
Yeah, they're pumping themselves.
You're pumping energy at the right moment so that turned out to be, overall, the energy cost is much lower.
Yeah, and I apologize. One other question: has anybody with these animals ever done anything like glue them together or add a little bit of weight to something to see if they can actually dynamically change that model, or if it's really kind of sort of fixed? You know what I mean? For their body.
Great question too. So actually, for the self-righting, we also wanted to test like a similar hypothesis, like how important this kinetic energy is. So we had a robot with which we can easily do that, but for the animal, we glued heavy beads to their feet, which would definitely change how they. I think their leg oscillation frequency is a little lower. The rough frequency is a little lower, but it does give them quite a bit more kinetic energy, which makes them much easier to ride. But we don't see evidence of learning. It seems quite random.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oops, sorry, it's my antivirus. Thought I could turn it off. Okay, so and we think that this might also inform robots. Basically, in such a regime, you really want to understand and control yourself well. And more broadly, back to the point I made earlier, people have mostly had limit cycle behaviors for like locomotion, and we don't have any dynamical systems model towards this yet, but we are hoping that what our study had suggested is that there might be attractors which can represent these transient locomotor modes that can be added onto limit cycles. But the difference is if you really want to kind of go between these, not try to stay within one attractor or rounds. And yeah, so we think this can be useful, analogous to early success. This is Dan Kotochek's group doing these composition of behavior using attractors funneled into each other to compose high-level behavior. We think that if we have such, if we add these new dynamical systems model that might be there, we can eventually start to compose locomotor transitions, except that we really have to go away from an attractor. And towards that, we really need to have more predictive physics model. Our energy landscape so far cannot predict dynamics, but also we need to add the intelligence aspects, which is important here. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, I'll quickly go through a relatively minor direction, which is limbless locomotion. So people have studied limbless locomotion again for many decades, and a lot of the studies have focused on how to move on relatively flat surfaces, even though you have complexity like sand deformation or obstacles. The body deformation of these animals is mostly in 2 dimensions. And we also have robots that begin to do this fairly well. But real snakes, obviously, they have to overcome 3D terrain. And you can see that compared to these snakes, our robots are still not as good. They slip a whole lot when they try to move through. This is already a lot of progress compared to a few years ago, but still not as good as the real snake. So the problem we looked at initially is, again, a very simplified system, looking at overcoming this large step, which can be found in their natural habitat. And when you think about these kinds of large obstacles, which is quite smooth and rigid, there's a big challenge, which is stability. For 2D, the body is inherently stable, but for 3 dimensions, and when you bend your body in 3 dimensions out of the plane, you can lose stability pretty easily. So in previous studies, these snakes can solve this challenge by using environmental asperities or creating their own anchor points to maintain stability. But these large step-like obstacles are rigid and smooth. We cannot do that. We think this is why previous snake robots solving this problem has largely been using this quasi-static gait, either following the leader or geometric path planning, but really trying to maintain quasi-static stability. So we looked at how the snake traversed such large obstacles. We developed a technique to interpolate between these markers in actually in both 3D translation and rotation. And this turned out to be 50% more accurate than previous methods, whose importance will come out later. So using this technique, we can then look at the gait. So here's a snake traversing a large high friction step. And you can see that it still makes a transition, although it's spatial and temporal. So it transitions from this lateral undulation and then part of the body going through this cantilevering to bridge the height difference, and then back to lateral undulation. And this very simple transitional gait seems to be quite robust when we vary the height and the friction of these surfaces. You definitely see the snake is struggling more and seems to be doing more adjustment, but the overall gait didn't change. So to understand this stability principle, we developed a simple snake robot. And you can see that applying this gait, we do have a very simple feedback control, which tells the robot where it is relative to the gap to initiate the transition. But other than that, it's just feed forward, feed forward. And you can see that it does pretty well, overcoming this 20% body length height step with high probability of 90%. This is done by my PhD student, Chen. And we didn't really try to optimize this, but it turned out our robot has a better performance So what's shown here is step height as a function of traversal time with the step height normalized to body length. And the slope, if you draw a line that connects the origin to your data, the slope of that line is going to then be your normalized traversal speed. So you can see that our robots actually outperform the majority of these previous robots. And here we haven't optimized it. Our motor speed is only half the maximum speed, so there might be potential increase. But it's still far behind the real snakes. So overall, we think that the study suggested that having this bio-inspired gait gives you better stability so that you can afford to move faster than quasi-static and ensure perfect stability. So we found in all the snake trials, it is 100% stable with the center mass falling within the support polygon. But this is not to say our robot is really all that great. When we challenge them to higher step of 40% body length, you can see it is pretty bad. It can very often start rolling and lose stability and eventually falls off. And the probability of traversal is only 50% here. So what could we do to improve their? Oh, actually, sorry. So this is actually just one failure mode. We also observe other kinds of failure mode, which I won't elaborate. But when we quantify these, we can see again this is highly stochastic. It seems that whenever you have some little noise or environmental noise or perturbation that introduces something, it gets really amplified and you kind of get thrown everywhere. So it's quite stochastic, but all of these failure modes result from this roll becoming larger and larger and eventually falling over. So what can we do to improve the robot towards the animal, which is perfectly stable? So there are three things. As we saw earlier, the animal can adjust themselves pretty well. They also have much more continuous body, but the simplest thing we can do is to make the body more compliant in our robot, which we did, and it increases the probability of traversal to 90%, helping the robot to recover from this asymmetry as shown here. And finally, just last couple of minutes, I'm really excited about the forward direction of this project. So you can see the snake barely slips compared to the robot. So our collaborator, Henry Astley, happened to perform experiments in his lab independently, which also found that this vertical bending of the body can be very useful in terms of generating propulsion, as you see in these two examples. So through our discussion, we believe that in the real 3D world, you really need to combine both vertical and lateral bending to generate propulsion, which likely contribute to the performance and versatility of snakes. So my student just did this quantification here. You can see very little slip except when the head turns. And now with our quantification method, Chen is able to get this, quantify where it seems to be pushing against the environment, and then classify whether it is through vertical pushing or horizontal pushing. We don't have force measurements, so we have a bunch of assumptions here, but it suggests that they occur with quite similar frequency. And our next step is to develop a sensorized terrain module to begin to measure forces. And finally, we have a robot in which we embedded sensors to measure the contact forces. So we're hoping to also use this to study the feedback principles here. Yeah, so the very, very long-term vision is perhaps we can someday have these physics models of the environment added to the geometric model to really enable our robots to do many things that we really want. So with that, I want to thank all my lab members, especially the PhD students and a few former students who have contributed to the work here, and also a lot of colleagues for very helpful discussion, and of course our funding agencies who support us. And thank you all for your attention. Oh, just one last, if you're interested, we have 2 review papers which covered much of what I talked about here. Yeah, and I'll just leave the summary up here and take questions.
got a mic here, so I'll pass it around. Any questions for Chen?
Hi, very cool presentation. I have a question about the snakes. So with your robot that you showed climbing the ledge, it had very distinct joints, right?
Yes.
And it seems like, with snakes, it's more of a continuous deformation, unlike the discrete deformation of the robot. Yes. And I'm wondering, how many joints do you really need in order to properly simulate the snake dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people have done snake modeling, both like analytical and numerical modeling. And if it's really to understand snake locomotion, most of the models I've seen, they typically have pretty large degrees of freedom. So almost like a continuous curve. And also even for robots, I think they are kind of on the order of 20 segments. I guess that's much less continuous, but it is still a pretty large degree of freedom. But there also have been studies that really try to look at the fundamental mechanical interaction. For example, there have been studies using 3 links to understand undulatory locomotion interacting with complex media like sand, and the principles there will actually translate quite surprisingly to higher degrees of freedom. One example is my former lab mate Ryan Maladin. He, in collaboration with Paul Emma Howard, they did this 3-link robot that undulates in model sand, and then they also did simulation in which they can increase the number of degrees of freedom, and they find that qualitatively what they find translate, although as you increase the degrees of freedom, the quantitatively there will be a shift asymptotically approaching what you would expect for a continuous shape. So there are such cases where I think that a small degrees of freedom would work, although I'm not sure about if that's the case when we consider this kind of all these large obstacles here. I think it's unlikely it's going to translate as well. And one thing I don't know if I have slides here. We have done some preliminary modeling. Oh, I don't have it here. Oh, actually here. Yeah, my students just recently developed a model using kind of a Lie group description of this continuous curve to try to model its interaction with this rough terrain. We have to make the terrain smooth to simplify the contact interaction. Yeah, we don't have much results yet here, but we're hoping to use this to combine with our experimental systems to begin to address this.
Thank you.
If you have questions online, go ahead and type them in the chat, and then we'll call on you. Anybody else in the room? Yep.
Yeah, so my question is about the first part versus the second part of your talk. The first part, you have hexapods that have exoskeletons are happy to collide with the substrate. And the second part is tetrapods, snakes that have soft outsides and maybe are less prone to collide or interact with the substrate in quite the same way, at least. And I'm curious what you think might differentiate pterodynamic control principles between hard outside animals and soft outside animals like tetrapods that can't afford to collide with the substrate because they're massive and they'll hurt themselves. So just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. I haven't thought very much about this on top of my head. I would say 2 things I can say. So one thing we have found is that in these, even for these small animals, at least in the systems we have looked at, these really large obstacles, they are going to collide initially, but after that, they don't really, I mean, they still have these small collisions, but they cannot really build up much momentum because of how strenuous these are. So the other point would be that I think that for, at least for snakes, I don't think snakes will really have much problem unless they maybe fall off of a cliff and hit the ground. I think that in these kinds of environment, snakes are typically really, really slow. So I mean, relatively speaking, they're really slow, at least in the lab. That's something actually I wondered about. Like I see this David Attenborough's video in which the snake can actually leap off momentarily, but typically their motion is considered more kinematic. Like they don't really build up much momentum. So I think at least in the case of snakes, that wouldn't be an issue. But I certainly agree. I think that for animals as large as humans or horses, or even like maybe on the scale of dogs, if you have very high speed running into something, then that's going to hurt you. So I think I would guess that the solution would be to not have such collision, but then still like make use of interaction. I guess if one thing I hope people can take away is that it's not really specifically these particular like cockroach or snakes, but really that I think we really need to understand this physical interaction aspects better than we have to really enable a lot of the real world applications more robustly and autonomously. And
Great,
that's not to really to replace the geometric obstacle avoidance, but to add on to that. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, Larry, you're online. You want to ask your question?
Yeah, one more question. I mean, how sensitive are snakes to changes in the friction on the surface they're moving on and their ability to exploit that? And I don't know, are we getting anywhere with that kind of thing?
Yeah. So people have studied this quite extensively for flat ground, which I think is also explained why we observe what we observe here. So it turns out that the friction properties of the scales, they have all these scales on their body, is pretty important. At least that's the current thinking. Although my colleague Henry Astley would think otherwise based on some of our recent evidence. But it is well known that snakes, that if you have a snake lying on a surface, if you move it laterally, you'll get really high friction. If you move it backward, you also get really high friction. But if you move it forward, you'll get much smaller friction. And it's thought that this anisotropic properties contributes to their ability to not slip much sideways when they undulate on a flat surface with sufficient friction, and also to give them, basically open them, increase their ability to generate thrust forward. But yeah, as I said, my colleague Henry, he thinks that in the real world, which is 3D, he has been watching all these snakes in the wild as well as at home and in his lab for like 30 years. And it is pretty rare that they're going to encounter like a flat surface unless they are crossing a road. So in this case, like as our very initial results show that if you have a sufficient large vertical asperity, you can simply push against that. And here actually we did modeling, which I can't go into for the sake of time, but the gravity is actually working in your way. Basically you kind of go out of that friction cone, then you just simply slide downward and propel yourself forward. So we think that when you have enough vertical asperities in the real world, then you don't really need to rely on lateral undulation entirely, and perhaps that will reduce this reliance on the friction properties. But anyway, here we found that they slip a whole lot more as people have demonstrated when it's flat surface. If you give it very little friction, or people have also put sleeves on them to make it isotropic, and they basically just undulates in the same place and go forward. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. That's very helpful. I guess what I was thinking though was, like, suppose that the surface is patchy and has areas of different friction on it, I guess.
Oh, I see.
their ability to actually,
Oh, I see. I see.
once they
Yeah,
grab something, yeah.
Yeah, I
So,
think that will.
Chen, you've
Yeah.
actually got a full set of meetings coming up here.
Oh,
So
Okay,
we're
I
gonna
can be
need-
very. I can be one sentence very brief. So
Okay.
people found that they can actually do what's called sinus lifting. They can lift part of the body to redistribute their weight to other parts to modulate the friction force. So I think they might be able to do that to accommodate this.
Thanks very much.
Well,
Thank you.
thanks, Chen, very much for a wonderful talk. Very inspiring and fascinating material. Let's thank
Yeah.
Chen one more time.
Thanks, everyone.